everyone. My name is Greg Brousseau, and I'm co-CEO of the Central Park Group here in New York. This is sort of the next in what's become a series of interviews. I guess we call it the CPG speaker series. And the intent of these interviews, the only intent of the interview is to be able to bring folks some of the intellectual capital to our clients and friends that we see throughout the year. So we're global private equity and hedge fund investors. We have access to a lot of global research firms and really fascinating people. When I go through these meetings many times, I always wish I could sort of share it. And that's really the purpose of what we try to do here. So it's sort of a CPG podcast, if you will. And we've had some pretty interesting people on. We've had Admiral James Stavridis, who's an author, he retired four-star general, NATO Supreme Commander. He spoke about leadership. We've had David Rubenstein, I think, a couple of times, co-founder of the Carlyle Group. Greg Zuckerman, who's a well-known writer at the Wall Street Journal. He had just finished a book on Renaissance, which is the largest hedge fund in the world. But today's guest is Colonel Terry Virts. If you look at his CV, he's described as a famous astronaut, but I think you'll agree that after the interview, that description is sort of the tip of the iceberg. I'll do a quick CV, I guess, and this is only part of it. And his career sort of timeline. Grew up in Maryland, 2 children, graduated from the Air Force Academy, academic distinction, went to Harvard Business School, was a fighter pilot, fought 45 combat missions, 4,300 hours of flight, 40 different aircraft. In 2000, he was accepted into the astronaut program as its youngest member, retired from NASA in 2016. He's done 3 spacewalks for a total of 19 hours, 212 days in space. He was the pilot in Endeavour 43 in 2010. And then the CV ends with his interest in baseball, astronomy, and coaching youth sports. So Terry, I don't get the astronomy interest. What's that all about? I'm only kidding. He's done some films, and I'm going to circle back to the film at the end of the interview. But he just recently directed a film called One More Orbit. He shot and he starred in the National Geographic IMAX, A Beautiful Planet. And Terry makes a really compelling case that every school-age kid should see that movie. And while he's been in space, and I'm going to go deeper into that in a second, he took 300,000 images, which is probably the largest inventory of images anybody's ever taken. He's written 4 books. One's about to come out. The book that's on the newsstand now or the bookstores now is entitled How to Astronaut, an Insider's Guide to Leaving Planet Earth. And it talks about mundane things like taking a shower, eating, sleeping. The way we build today's discussion and the topics I really want to cover, first is commercialization. There's a lot going on right now. I guess the leading lights are SpaceX and Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, but there's a lot of other projects out there. And there's a lot of interest and there's a lot of noise about how space may or may not become a scalable commercial entity or opportunity set. So I want to talk about that a little bit. But I really want to talk about resilience, especially during this really difficult period, pandemic, lockdown. I'm going to have Terry talk a little about any useful insights he might have how to approach today's environment. The last, I don't know if it's the last chapter, but it's towards the end of the book he's got out now. I think it's described as being stuck in space and what happens if an astronaut gets stranded in space. So why don't we start there? And I'm just going to give you 2 sentences and then I'm just going to hand it over. And Terry, you can tell the story. In space, 3 cargo ships, which are supposed to bring you supply, blow up, leaving you and the crew in the space station. You end up there for 7 months. The quote I read, you said, we were suddenly stuck. It hit home that in space, I was faced with sudden isolation. So maybe you can just give us the backstory and what occurred during that period.
Yeah, well, so thanks for that introduction, Greg. We were on our way for a half-year mission, and right as we were launching, this orbital Cygnus rocket at a Wallops, Virginia, blew up, full of our food and supplies and underwear. And then a few months later, a Russian Progress blew up, which also launches on the Soyuz rocket. It's the same rocket that people launch on. And then at the end of my mission, a SpaceX Dragon blew up. So NASA lost 3 capsules in an 8-month period. But when the second one, when that Russian one blew up, the Russians decided not to launch our replacement crew because they wanted to do the investigation to make sure that, that wouldn't happen to a manned launch. Luckily, it was unmanned. Luckily, it was just cargo. But had it been people, it would have killed the crew. So um, they said, why don't you stick around, because you don't have a replacement crew and you're low on supplies and we don't know when you're coming back. So it was kind of a when COVID happened back in February, March, I went, man, this kind of reminds me of that time I was stuck in space. So I started to write a book about it, and this may end up being a documentary, but there's a lot of lessons to learn. So you want to talk about some of the things that, I
Yeah.
guess, the way that we handled it. So I was commander um, of the station then, and uh, the most important thing was our attitude. And there's been a couple times during the space program where astronauts got stuck and they had to wait around. And usually it's really depressing. It's like when you're in the military and you're on a deployment, as long as you know when your last day is, you can stand on your head in a bucket of crap for however long you need to. But as long as you know the end's coming. But when that end starts to move, that's when morale falls off the table. So I was really proud of my crew. It was me and Anton and Samantha, Russian, who just called me a few minutes ago, actually, to wish me happy birthday, which is cool. And and we basically said, look, guys, we got the rest of our lives down on Earth. Let's make the most of it while we're here. We had some work that we wanted to do. I used the time to take pictures and film this IMAX movie, A Beautiful Planet. And I knew that I was ready to come home, but there was nothing I could do about it. It was one of those situations where why worry about something you can't control? So although there was a lot of strategies, making sure we were busy, keeping our exercise up, I tried to do something creative. I was making this movie. I had all these different strategies, but the most important one by far was our attitude. COVID is going to end. It sucks. It's bad for the economy. Some people are dying. It's not a good thing. It's not going to last forever. Humanity's going to go on. People who are flexible are going to do better in the future economy. But keeping that attitude was super important for my crew.
So let's just stay on this isolation thing up there. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
did you have a clear understanding when this was going to end? Did you feel like there was a risk that wasn't going to end? I mean, where on the risk curve were you there?
Well, I mean, it wasn't, we knew they wouldn't just leave us up there to die. So the big question was, did that same problem affect our vehicle so that we couldn't fly home? And we didn't think it did, but they had to make sure it didn't. Had that been the case, we would have had to wait for a lot longer while they launched a Soyuz without any crew. And then, so that would have extended us even more. But as it was, it ended up extending us for about a month, and we didn't know. I mean, and my NASA managers didn't tell me anything. I was talking to the space station program manager, Mike Suffredini, and he told me what he could, which was nothing. So one of the things I did as the commander, I didn't want rumors on the ship, if you will. So I had a meeting every day, and I said, guys, don't pay attention, whatever. At nighttime, the whole crew would get together, and I would literally go around body by body. What did you hear today? What did you hear today? And everybody just got the rumors out, and we were hearing that aliens shot down the spaceship, and we were, especially the Russian, and in the press, who knows what people are saying. People were saying crazy stuff, but at least we got it out. It wasn't like a secret rumor, and we laughed, and then we went about our business. So I just getting that news out, I think, was an important part of keeping our sanity.
How much space, I mean, in the can itself, I mean, how much space did you have? I'd read in the book that you thought getting through this, you have this 10 things I learned from being stuck in space and
Right.
isolation. I want to get to that. But
Right.
two of them were creative activity and
Right.
physical activity. I mean, do you
Right.
have enough space to move around, at least physical activity? How does that work?
So the space station is pretty big. They say it's 2 747s. I think it's more like 1 747, but it's in these different modules, and there's only 6 of us up there. So there's enough room for you to be by yourself in a module while you're working on something, or you've got your own little phone booth size sleeping quarter. So even though it's not unlimited, it's reasonably big, and there's a variety. Like the Russian side has a different color and look and feel and sound, and so there's a little bit of variety. I was worried before I flew in space at all. I was worried I'd get cabin fever and go crazy, and I was there 200 days and I didn't. So the station itself, I think, is big enough, which is important. And having that personal space was really important. So one of the things is for people stuck in Corona, if you're by yourself, you have to figure out some way to socialize, right? It's not, humans are, no man's an island, right? Humans are social creatures. But if you're living with your parents and your spouse and your kids, you may be on the other side where you need to get away some point. So I think people need a balance of having your own place where you can just be by yourself, but also having contact with other humans. And that was something we had to focus on in space. And it's something people really need to focus on down here on Earth too.
You said one of the challenges was interpersonal relationships might have been the
Mhm.
hardest. I mean, these weren't
Yeah,
all great English speaking partners up there, right? And
right.
you're talking about 7 months, 24/7, sort of the ultimate quarantine. What,
Yeah.
talk about that?
So, and it's funny because my Expedition 43 crew, we really got along well. One of the Russians, Gennady Padalka, flew on me on my One More Orbit, the movie I just made. We flew around the Earth, set a world record, and Gennady came with us on that. So, we're great friends this day. Like I just mentioned, Anton, the guy that I flew with on the Soyuz, just called me 30 minutes ago, literally just hung up. So ironically, hanging out with the Russians was one of the highlights of my time in space. I love those guys. As a commander, I made an effort every night I put my little green bags of food in a Ziploc and I'd float down to the Russian segment and have dinner with them. Because it's very easy to just be by yourself and not do that. And that's true on Earth. If you're isolated all the time, you have to make an effort to socialize somehow. And that was a super important part. But even with your spouse, if you were there for 200 days in a row all day, that wouldn't be healthy. So you need to figure out some strategy to get alone, get by yourself for some amount of time, just to keep healthy relationships going. And you need to figure out a way to do feedback too, which is probably the most important thing I learned when I went to Harvard for business school. Um, the business hardcore stuff was interesting, but it was the soft skills, the interpersonal skills, that was by far probably the most important for me anyway. As commander of the space station, it was the best commander training that I had, was learning that stuff.
So you took this enormous amount of images. I
Yes.
read in somewhere, I read this, I think it was Buzz Aldrin, maybe others, had this very spiritual, not awakening, but um, impression when you're positioned like that, looking down on the earth. And those are
Mhm.
probably a couple of glimpses over what, a week or two, a couple of
Yeah.
days. You were there a long time and
Yeah.
kept taking those photos. I mean, what was the zeitgeist there for you? Or, was it a bit of a spiritual
Yeah. So
experience?
yeah, it really was. So my basic, who I am spiritually, I'm a Christian. After spending that much time in space, I'm a lot less of a black and white guy. It's easy when you're young or whatever, everything's black and white, right and wrong. And I'm much less so after spending that much time in space. When you see Earth, you're like, man, that thing's been around for a long time and it's going to be around for a long time. And it's hard to get too upset about things, because it's also hard to get too excited about things, because, like, I just have a much longer picture. I was doing this spacewalk, and 99% of spacewalks are work. And I was just face full of metal. I was plugging in cables, working, sweating. And I had a second waiting on my crewmate. So I stopped and I turned around, and the most like spectacular sunrise you can imagine was happening. I remember it was blue atmosphere with the red and orange where the sun was. And it was like I was hearing from God. Like, this is God's view of creation. Humans aren't meant to see this. And then I had to get back to work because I had to plug in the next cable and I was behind my schedule. So I kind of came away with, and it wasn't even spiritual. It was more like from a scientific point of view. When you look at the human body, I spent months doing ultrasound on my eyeball and on my brain and on my heart, and this laser scan of my eyeballs, and studying all these different microorganisms and fish and plants and mice, and the planet and the universe and the galaxy. And I just I came away from it from a scientist point of view. I'm like, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. This is so amazing. Somebody smart had to make
Right.
it. Now, I'm not saying that as a religious thing. That's more of a
Sure.
scientific thing.
Logic, right.
I was just studying, there's some things about the brain, and God, what a complicated organism and how much software is in there. I just, as a scientist, I don't see how that makes itself, but that's not a religious argument. That was just kind of my own personal spiritual point of view.
You just shot with an SLR digital camera, nothing too fancy.
Well, I mean, they were the best SLR digital cameras in the world. So we had Nikon
I meant in
D4s.
terms of size. Did you
Oh, right.
handheld?
They were SLRs, right?
Yeah.
I did have a Red Dragon, which was the first ever ultra high def. I shot like the first ultra high def. NASA did a compilation of it. It was really cool back in 2015. So Red is like a Hollywood movie camera company, and love those guys. They're awesome. So I shot with the Red Dragon, and then for the IMAX movie, we used a Canon C500. So those are kind of the big Hollywood size, but for the most part, it was Nikon SLRs and also a Canon 1DC SLR for the camera nerds out there.
Right. Okay. I've got a series of questions. I want also, I didn't set this up in terms of how I met Terry. I have a good friend who's a film director, makes commercials, makes films, and these guys are working on a documentary. And he was telling me about Terry, and I said, I'd love to see if I could talk to Terry a little bit and see if he'd ever have an interest in coming on doing one of these interviews. And to set this up, Terry and I did a bunch of calls together that went on for a while. And I mean, I could just go for a long time here with, on one of my questions, it's like, talk about debris fields. But while we're on the topic, what's a debris field?
So in space, at the altitudes where the space station is, if you have like a piece of junk or debris, it'll be there for years before it'll eventually burn up, because even though there's not really atmosphere, there's a little bit of atmosphere. There's a few oxygen and nitrogen molecules flying around. And if there's a satellite or a spaceship, that atmosphere slows it down, which makes it descend. And the space station's 400 kilometers up. It'll take you years before you hit the atmosphere and burn up. If you're at 300 miles where Hubble is, it'll take you centuries. And if you're at 1,000 miles or higher, you're never coming down. It's there forever. So when nations decide that they want to blow up other satellites to demonstrate their military strength, that debris is there for a long time, if not forever. Or if satellites lose control, they die and they accidentally run into other satellites, that debris is there for a long time. And both of those things have happened. In fact, in 2007, the Chinese did a military demonstration, unfortunately, and that debris is still there. When I was commander of the station, we had to maneuver to avoid the debris that the Chinese had created. The Indians, unfortunately, last year decided that they needed to demonstrate this capability, and they blew up a satellite at high altitude, which is insane. And so there's a risk if there's too much debris. There's this thing called a Kessler syndrome, which is what happened in the movie Gravity. It was dramatic, but it's true. It could happen, where you just start getting more debris and more debris and more debris, which is one of the real dangers of these massive constellations, these 10,000 satellite constellations. A couple of different companies want to do it. They're launching without any regulation. There's no real oversight or government. There's no Coast Guard, right, or FAA for space. And so it's a real serious, it's not a national security problem. It's a global security problem, because if space becomes unusable, it's unusable for everybody. And it hurts us more than, the lower unadvanced countries. They don't care, but advanced countries like America, Asia, Europe, it's a real threat for sure.
Let's talk about risk for a second. Not so much your fighter pilot career, but there was some stuff in there about just maybe unappreciated risks, not only taking off or reentry, but just medical issues, changing pressure, muscle atrophy, cancer. What are some of the issues that you guys face because you're in such an aberrational atmosphere?
Right. So there's a lot of risks in space. Like there's a lot of risk in everything. So the key is figure out what the risks are. And then figure out what risks need to be mitigated, what risks need to be avoided completely, what risks can be accepted. You spend your resources on the things that you need to mitigate. You don't worry about the stuff you don't need to worry about, and the stuff you need to avoid completely, you just don't do that thing. So you kind of need to have a systematic way to put that risk in there. But for astronauts, there's obviously blowing up on launch or landing is bad. But there's also, health risks, like cancer. Like you said, I got skin cancer after both of my space missions, and that may or may not come from radiation. That it's cancer, so you can't really say. There's probabilities, but there's also unknown things, like you're in this carbon dioxide soup. Even though we have CO2 removal, it doesn't work that well, and so who knows what the long-term effects are. Are you more susceptible to Alzheimer's, or, early onset dementia, high blood pressure? I don't know. So there's that kind of risk. And then there's like your personal risk. There's a lot of stress on your personal family. I know for mine, there was for sure, and on a lot of people. So there's just different risks that you take as an astronaut. Then there's rewards too. You get to fly in space, which is pretty awesome.
Yeah. I want to maybe end the resilient piece on this. Coming back to COVID, you had made a list of 10 things that you think were relevant to people, especially if this continues for a while. I mean, people are in different situations. Some people aren't that affected, but some people are pretty locked down.
Right.
You want to just talk about some of those?
Yeah, some of the things I thought, one of them is stay busy. There's nothing worse for a space crew or a crew going to Antarctica, or if you're locked down in COVID, you need to find some reasonable tasks to do. Keep yourself on a schedule. Manage your news. Don't watch CNN 24/7. Don't watch Twitter 24/7, because they get extra money if they have some doom and gloom that causes you to click on there. So you really have to manage that. I think doing something artistic, you can learn these new iPhone, all the different buttons on how to take pictures, or get an SLR. You can write that blog or write the novel, whatever. I've been writing a couple books in quarantine. Exercising, you got to keep some type of exercise going on. You got to balance your social stuff. Like I was talking earlier, you can't be around people 24/7, but you also can't be isolated 24/7.
Yeah.
So you need to figure out a way to manage that. And then the attitude, for me, the attitude in life in general, no matter what happens. I mean, if you lose your job, it's not the end of the world. Life is going to go on. There's other things that can happen. If you lose all your money, betting on options, and all you've got is a six-pack in the back of a taxi cab, life's going to go on. So I've had some really, really bad things happen. My life has been almost all good. The most amazingly great stuff's happened, but I've had some pretty shitty things happen too. And I thought life was over, but it wasn't. And life is really good in the future. So you have to figure out some way to motivate yourself, realize you're going to get through it, and that's part of being a human, adapting.
I want to encourage people to send in any questions. I've gotten a couple here, and I want to ask them. They're a couple of them are pretty interesting. So again, you hit the Q&A button. This one question I have from Tegan says, do you have any tips for teens aspiring to be an astronaut?
Mm-hmm.
It's a nice question.
So they can figure out, they can go online and figure out what they need to do. NASA needs a technical degree. Being a test pilot is a good thing, or there's all the mechanics is one thing, but the tip that I would give them is don't tell yourself no. Being an astronaut is a crazy dream, or wanting to start your own company can be a crazy dream, or even being a doctor, man. Today, my son's applying to med school. It is insanely competitive. But if you tell yourself no, you're never going to get it. If you tell yourself, yeah, you got to figure out what the path is. You can't just say you want to do something. There's going to be a lot of hard work and steps you need to take. And then go for it. Everybody's been given gifts and talents. If you're pursuing where your gifts and talents are, you're going to love it. And you might get it. If you don't get it, you figure out the next strategy. But the key is, don't take yourself out of the fight, even if other people say you're never going to get this. And then don't just use words. Words are easy. We were talking about that, Greg, the other day. You actually have to come up with a plan. You actually have to put in the work. And if you get it, that's awesome. If you don't get it, at least you tried, and you can maybe try a different strategy, apply again the next time, and you might get it. So that's my advice. Don't tell yourself no.
Yeah, I want to end on that whole piece when we get to the end, because we had a long discussion on that, and I think it's a really positive thing to end on. I mean, one thing Terry was telling me, we were talking about the short movie directing career he's had and how interested he is. And I said, so what are some of the projects you're working on? And he said, well, I want to direct a James Bond film. And I'm like, even for this resume, that's a stretch goal. But we'll come back to that. So let me go to commercialization. So you were going to say something on that, Terry. I interrupted you. I felt like I just
Yeah,
interrupted you.
that's a
On the
really
James Bond.
Oh, the James Bond. Okay.
Yeah.
We'll talk about James Bond and then let's talk
Okay.
about commercializing space because I just had a really interesting conversation tonight about that. Yeah, that's a crazy goal. How am I going to get to direct a James Bond film? But I just got to direct a legitimate, 7-figure budget, 200 people in the credits movie last year. And a year before that, I would have thought that was crazy. So but I can't just say I want to do it. If I'm going to do it, there's a lot of stuff I have to do. And and I'm not 25. And so if I'm going to do it, I need to start moving on it. And I understand that. We talked last night. I have some friends of mine who are, everybody here knows. And I just need to get some mentorship and then put the effort in if it's going to happen, or if it's not going to happen, say that, go on and pick a different career in life or whatever. But I kind of fell in love with directing after doing this. I made a short film this summer called Cosmic Perspective with Janneke Mikkelsen helped me make it. And it's about space photography and how it's changed our perceptions of the world. And these are really fun projects I'm doing, but they're not scripted with actors. I'm not having to direct actors. I have done that in some short films, but that's a big step. If I'm going to get there, I've got a lot of work to do for sure.
So let's go to commercialization. This is a big topic, and it's very much in the news between Bezos and SpaceX and Elon Musk and China.
Right.
Who's ahead? Who's behind? Will this ever be scalable? Will ever reach a level of scalability? You had said when we were talking yesterday, there seemed to be 3 buckets we talked about. One is space tourism. The other one was satellite communication. And then I took you on a tangent about compounds and materials. Is there stuff on asteroids or planets that could be commercially viable and very much desirable? So maybe start with tourism.
Yeah.
What do you think that looks like?
Well, I think it's going to start next year. There's 2 companies that are going to be doing it. Virgin Galactic and Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin are going to be launching people into low Earth orbit on 5-minute. You get 5 minutes in space. You're floating, completely floating. There's the round Earth. It's black as space. You're going to be in space, but you're just going straight up and straight back down. So you're not going into orbit. And it's going to be awesome. It's going to cost a couple $100,000 to go. There's going to be a lot of danger associated with that. But I think there's a pretty significant number of Earthlings that have the means to save up a couple $100,000 and would want to go into space. So I think that's a market that's for sure going to happen. There is a bigger space tourist market where it's in the 25 to 50 to $75 million to get into orbit. And the Russians have taken a few space tourists up on the space station. America is going to be doing that soon on SpaceX capsules, and a company called Axiom is going to be flying them. But that's obviously very limited. Tom Cruise wants to make a movie, so he's going to fly himself and his director up potentially in another year or so. But those are space tourists. That's a different level. But I think the low Earth orbit is going to be happening soon.
What's the story of this China artist trip around the moon, cost $1 billion story?
Yeah, so Elon Musk has built the Falcon 9, which is kind of disrupted global launch markets everywhere. It's taken Russia out of the picture almost. It's taken Boeing and Lockheed out of the picture almost. It's ended Europe. Elon is really disrupted. But he has a much bigger rocket called the BFR, which of course stands for the Big Falcon rocket. And he wants to sell, I think he has sold apparently, a ticket to a Japanese, not Chinese, a Japanese billionaire who's going to bring a group of artists and writers and, creative people with him. They're not going to land on the moon. They're just going to do a lap around the moon and come back. We don't know a lot of the details. Elon's big on promotion, maybe short on some of the specifics. But, we'll see what happens with that. That would be a pretty cool trip to go on. For sure. So that's not going to be a common, if going into low Earth orbit is expensive, the The suborbital flights are a couple 100,000. Low Earth orbit's 50 million. Going to the moon is going to be hundreds of millions, if not, a billion or something. It's going to be expensive.
Yeah, I'd ask you the question, how long does it take a round trip to the moon and back? I think you said 3 days.
Well, that's one way. So if you want
One
to
way, 3
return,
days.
yeah, my favorite part of Kennedy's speech was land a man on the moon and return him safely to the earth. That was my favorite part of the speech. So if you're going to do a round trip, it's a week
A
probably.
week.
Depends on your trajectory, but about a week.
So I said, in the future, accommodations. I said, could you see that on
Yeah.
a planet, or do you see that in a space station? And you had said that the delta between the cost of space station and actually landing on a planet is astronomical.
I think so. So it's 2 extra zeros to go from suborbital to orbit. And it's probably 2 extra zeros to go from orbit to landing on a planet and coming back to Earth, which is a lot. I mean, it's not 2 or 5 times more. It's 2 orders of magnitude more. Landing on planets is probably in the realm of governments. Governments don't do very much good. They're very bureaucratic and not innovation at all. But one thing they do well is raising money. They can tax people and create a lot of money. So I think that getting on the surface of planets is going to require government assistance, at least for the near foreseeable future.
On the continuum of this topic, or just commercialization, how would you line up the players? I mean, I guess the leading light is the government, right? They have the most resources, data, et cetera, but they're unlikely to commercialize, or maybe they're not. And then do you go Musk, and then you go Bezos, then you go China, Russia? How does that line up?
So no bucks, no Buck Rogers, to quote Tom Wolfe in The Right Stuff. So the government's definitely, they've got the money, so they can just keep things going. In fact, their incentive is to keep things going. They don't want to just finish a program, because then everybody's out of their job and the congressman loses his money for his district. Jeff Bezos has government type money. I mean, he can fund his program for a long time to come and not notice it. So I think, and he's smart. He's a really smart guy, and he hires really smart people. So I think Bezos is really well positioned for the 21st century. Now, he won't be here for the whole 21st century, but if he sets up an organization that can have a succession plan and can propagate itself, his organization is really well positioned to dominate the 21st century, I think. Elon Musk has generated a lot of flashy attention, and his Falcon 9's been unbelievably successful. It's completely disrupted the launch industry globally. But China is not far behind. They copy everything that we do. They've got a lot of money. They want to be seen as succeeding in space, because for them, it shows that they're at the top of the technology pinnacle, just like Apollo showed that we beat the Soviets to the moon, or Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin showed that they beat us to space. Having a successful space program shows that China is right up there as a peer with us. And they really crave that. They want to be our peer. They want to be our leader. They don't want to be our peer. They want to be ahead of us. So I think that China is also a very large threat in the long term. They're not necessarily innovative. They're good at copying, which some people would call stealing. But that's not going to last forever. Our universities are educating hundreds of thousands of Chinese PhDs every year. And so they stick around and work. And so in the long term, I think our culture is going to rub off on them. And I think it's going to be a China, Jeff Bezos 21st century battle to see who's at the top in space.
And do you think just Bezos, and maybe secondarily Elon, do you think they have a clear commercial goal, or do you think this is throw a lot of money, a lot of PR, a lot of intellectual interest, and we'll see where we go from here? But do you think they actually see a commercial cornering some market that others? There's clearly going to be a barrier to entry once you get. And both those entrepreneurs can argue that that's how they made their billions, is cornering that market.
I mean, the way to make $1 billion is to have a monopoly. I mean, it's not American, but it's the way, that's what you don't want competition, and you want to crush them as soon as they come in. And the barriers to entry in the launch field are pretty good. There's a guy named Tim Ellis who's got Relativity Aerospace. I don't even know if he's 30 years old yet. I wrote a he was like Time Magazine top 100 entrepreneur. I wrote his little blurb for Time Magazine last year. He's doing 3D printed rockets. He's amazing. He's raised over 100 million in private capital. He's an amazing guy, wonderful man, super smart, young kid, but he's running this kind of global thing, and he's competing with Elon and Jeff. So I really admire that. And his differentiation is that his parts are 3D printed, so they're a lot cheaper, and that gives him some flexibility that Elon and Jeff don't have. So, but with that being said, man, getting into the launch market, if you're talking about commercializing space, there's lots of things you can do, but getting into the launch market is, unless you have a really unusual, unique idea, which there aren't that many left, Elon and Jeff are going to kind of dominate that. And there's still ULA, which is Boeing and Lockheed. Northrop Grumman has their Omega rocket. That may or may not happen. Besides Elon and Jeff, there's other big players with lots of money, and there's Russia, and there's China, and there's Europe too. So there's a lot. The barrier to entry and launch is significant. There's other ways to do commercialization in space without those barriers to entry.
But ultimately, it's not about tourism for those guys. The scalability just isn't there. It's about satellites, right?
Yes. Well. So what they're doing is launch, and so
you want to talk about the satellites?
Yes, they want to launch the satellite. When you look at the piece of the pie, like commercial new space is like 0.1%. NASA's maybe a couple percent. The US DoD, Space Force, and the CIA and other NRO and stuff, they're maybe twice the size of NASA. We spend twice as much on military space as we do on NASA. And then that's like a few percent. And then satellites are the hugest part by far of what we spend. So, internet communication, SATCOM, telephones, any kind of communication that goes through satellites is by far the biggest part of the market. And that's not very innovative. It's the same players making the same telecom satellites. That's not, the sexy new stuff. That's just kind of the bread and butter. It's like laptops, in the 90s, Dell was exciting, and there was HP, and there was all these different companies, and they just got commoditized. I mean, there's nothing exciting about computers are just a commodity now. And so those satellites have kind of just become a commodity, but there's other commercial stuff. The call I had tonight, Greg, is really interesting about manufacturing in space, which is one of the kind of the last frontiers, which people haven't really achieved yet. The space station is good for science experiments. Like, you can test something out, but it's not good to set up a manufacturing facility. And when you can do that, there's a few types of materials. When I have done some work with an organization called CASIS, or the ISS National Lab, it's like the NGO that gets science to and from the station. 3D printed organs, so human organs printed in weightlessness. You can grow much pure, like kidney. You could grow the kidney material really well in weightlessness in a way that you can't when there's gravity. Or you can grow silicon chips in weightlessness. They're more pure.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so there's some materials you can make in weightlessness, and we just haven't had launch costs cheap enough. We haven't had satellites cheap enough. We haven't been able to get stuff to and from space to make it financially worthwhile. But I think that day may be coming. And that was the call with a guy that I had about space manufacturing, which was really interesting. He's a serious veteran of a popular space company. It was a really interesting project. So I think that's one kind of last frontier in space. You and I were talking about resources, right? So like mining the moon for certain materials, or asteroids for certain materials. There's been a lot of money spent on researching that in the last few years. There's definitely interest on the moon. People think there's water.
Talk about. Oh, no, stay. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Keep going. People think there's water. Go ahead.
Water on the moon is a big thing, because water can be made into water, which you can drink, or it can be broken into hydrogen and oxygen, which is rocket fuel. And you could also make electricity with hydrogen and oxygen in something called fuel cells, which I did on the space shuttle. Apollo 13 did, and it exploded and caused the Ron Howard movie. So water would be super interesting if we could get it. I think that's going to be really hard, because it's frozen at 40 degrees Kelvin. It's buried under meters of the worst dust that exists anywhere in the solar system. But another material I think that's interesting is helium-3, which is this. yeah, this isotope of helium, it comes out of the sun. The sun's nuclear fusion makes helium-3. It's a helium atom with one less neutron instead of instead of 2 protons, 2 neutrons. It's 2 protons, 1 neutron. And anyway, it's really useful for fusion. So there's different ways you can do nuclear fusion on Earth, but one of them would be using helium-3. The problem is helium-3 doesn't really exist on Earth, but it does exist on the moon. So that would be, if we could find somebody who knew how to do fusion with helium-3, that would generate the market. And just like any market, I've been working with some graphene companies with some really cool technology, but
Yeah.
until there's demand, until they know how to use the graphene, it's not really worth producing the graphene, right? Like, why make it if no one's gonna buy it?
Well, Musk, I think
Same thing
Musk,
with helium-3.
I think Musk would say there's not a commercial application. He doesn't see it as a fuel source, and he thinks it's too expensive to scale anyway, and it's a waste of time to discuss.
Helium-3.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm just a fighter pilot. I'm not a nuclear physicist, but that's one of the potential uses of the moon, would be for, a resource like that. There's also rare earths. Um, Musk also wants to send, 1 million people to Mars. And I would argue that that doesn't make sense, because you can never have a habitable place. Mars can never be habitable for one really simple reason. Um, there's no magnetic field around Mars, and nor will there ever be unless we can figure out how to spin the center of the planet. And without a magnetic field, the solar wind will strip away any atmosphere. So some people talk about terraforming Mars. You could put, nuclear material in the ice poles. If you got a small telescope, you can look at Mars at night, and when the axis is pointed towards Earth, you can see the polar ice caps. You can see water on Mars from Earth. From my little 5-inch telescope, I could see it in Houston. The problem is, if you melted that water and you made an atmosphere, it would immediately just get sucked off into space, because there's no magnetic field. The Earth has a great magnetic field. That's why there's beautiful aurora. And that's why we're here talking. Without that magnetic field, there wouldn't be any life here. So anyway, that's just a
Yeah.
tangent about Mars.
I'm going to just end on this material thing, but there still continues to be a lot of innovation comes out of NASA and space flights. And I mean, there was Teflon, I think Velcro, a lot of engineering protocols. My favorite, Tang.
Tang. We still use Tang, by the way. They give us these fruit drinks in like little silver bags, and that was like my favorite thing, was to drink red and orange and yellow, whatever the fruit drinks. And I asked the food lady at NASA that does our astronaut food, and she's like, yeah, it's just Tang. So they still make our drinks. It's awesome. I love it. But yeah,
is there
innovation,
more discovery? Yeah.
Yeah. I think there is. I mean, you wouldn't describe a government organization as being innovative normally, but NASA does have some pretty cool, like, small organizations that come up with stuff. And there are offices, at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, there's an office of commercial partner, where they can take stuff that the government learned and funnel it into companies. A lot of the stuff is kind of useless, but every once in a while there's something that's useful. I know on the station, when I was there, we did 250 experiments in space. Some of them were just interesting science experiments, but a few of them are really applicable. In particular, I did a couple of drug investigations for bone and muscle drugs, and also E. coli and salmonella vaccines. There were some combustion experiments that help us understand the fundamentals, like at the physics level, what's happening when you burn something, that you can see in space, because there's no convection on Earth. Whenever you burn something, there's convection. In space, there's not. Things burn in a ball. So there are some practical things that you learn. And frankly, there's so much subsidy going on there. No company would ever fund these experiments, but because the government funds them, we learn stuff, and sometimes it becomes useful. A lot, usually it doesn't, but it's a high risk, high reward kind of thing. And I think it's a good thing. I think government funded research in general is a good thing. And a lot of times it gets a bad name, and some congressmen will latch on to their shrimp mating or something, which has nothing to do with what's really happening. It's some minor part. And some of that science can get a bad name.
A couple of questions. Do you think government, basically the question is, do you think you're going to need regulation to sort of fix this debris issue? Is
I
it
do.
severe enough? Or do you think it's going to be solved through private incentives?
No, there's no private incentive. The private incentive is to get your satellites into space as soon as possible before there is regulation. The
But space is a
for
big place. Is collision really a threat?
It happens. The Russians had a satellite that died 10 years ago, just a communication satellite, and it ran into an Iridium satellite, an operational Iridium satellite, created a big cloud of debris. We have to maneuver the space station a couple times a year to avoid this debris that's still there, and it'll be there
Wow.
forever.
Wow.
So it happens, and who's going to pay to clean it up, right? Like this is the moral hazard. This is the 2008
Yeah.
financial crisis. This is too
Yeah.
big to fail. All
Yeah.
these ideas on risk where somebody lets you and I take risk because we can make a ton of money, and if we fail, then other people will have to pay for it. I'm looking at Wall Street in the background there, right behind your your Zoom thing. That's a lot of our society. Carbon, right? The people who are burning carbon aren't going to pay to protect Mauritius, the island of Mauritius, when the sea level rises. In the same way that there's no private incentive to fix space debris. I think the government, and it can't just be America, it has to be some type of global treaty, and America has to be in the lead, but we need to get everybody on board where you're just required to have, your satellites have to be able to deorbit themselves or send themselves off into they call them graveyard orbits, or they just have to be able to take care of themselves. And then if not, there's got to be a penalty for it. And then people will behave responsibly.
Um, Before I wrap this up in a minute, I want you to go back to this IMAX movie, This Beautiful Planet. You'd said that you thought this is a really important film for kids in schools. You want to just expand on that?
Yeah. So when we made this Beautiful Planet, and I just helped. I wasn't like the main guy, but I did a lot of it, and I took a lot of interest in it, and I learned from our director, Tony Myers. And when we made it, I remember thinking, I would love if every kid in North America, because IMAX is Canadian and Tony was Canadian, so we got to include Canada and Mexico too. So every middle schooler should be seeing this movie because it's a cool movie. It's space. It's international. It's wow. There's Americans and Russians. It's men and women. They're doing science. The earth is beautiful. There's an environmental message there. I just think all these messages that came from this movie would be so good. And then if like some 6th or 7th grader sees that and go, wow. And there's probably a lot of 6th and 7th graders in America and maybe in Canada that are not raised in environments where they see stuff like this and where they have any like a role model that might encourage them to pursue a career in science or technology or whatever. What a cool vision to show everybody. Every school in America could do that, and then we could provide their teachers with some content, and the science teacher would have something to talk about for whatever. The foreign language teacher would say, did you see these people working together? They all had to speak other languages. And this, in the same way, the movie I made, One More Orbit, there's a lot of the same themes. We did it on the anniversary of Apollo, and it was, there's aviation. I talk about what it's like to orbit for me in space and what it was like to orbit in an airplane. We orbited the Earth in an airplane and a spaceship, and that kind of thing would inspire kids and help their teachers out. So I think that was a vision I've had, and I haven't done anything to make it happen. Again, that's bad on me. That's just words. I haven't acted to make it happen.
Where can people find that One More Orbit movie? Where's that available?
It's on Amazon and iTunes and
it is.
Cable TV. It's just I think it's in 20 different, pay-per-view kind of things.
All right. I'm going to try to move this towards an end because it's, I wanted to keep it to an hour. We're getting there. Terry's in Dubai, what is it? 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning?
It was. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm good though.
Okay. I had a question from Andrew, hardest obstacle you faced, but I'm going to weave it into this last piece. This goes a little bit beyond resilience and has a little bit what we were talking about last night. And there's this whole philosophy you have sort of about attitude. And that, what's not in your CV that we discussed was, your mom and dad didn't graduate from college. You were in a college program where there was an opportunity, I guess, at the academy to register or apply for astronaut training. Nobody did. You did. You got in. You were the youngest in that program. And it seems like a lot of your resume has that energy to it, you know?
Yeah.
And that's where I come into the James Bond thing. I was giving you a hard time. I actually don't think it's beyond you. I'd say if there's anybody I would not bet against, it's you. But this whole philosophy about not telling yourself no, I think it's really worked for you big time. And you want to just maybe expand on that a little bit for people?
Yeah. You know, one of the experiences I've had probably that illustrate that, yeah, I got picked to be an astronaut, which was amazing. Uh, but leaving the astronaut office, I think, was even harder because I had spent 30 years in the Air Force. I just spent 16 of those years at NASA. I've been getting that government paycheck twice a month. You know, I had a family, and I was done with the government. I wanted to go out into private sector. I wanted to do these. I wanted to write a book. You know, I love TV and film. I love business. I'm a guest lecturer a couple times a year at Harvard Business School. There's all these things I wanted to do, and I was still in my 40s. And it was like, do I stick around? You know, that my boss said it's going to be 5 years before you fly again. And if I flew again, I would be doing the same thing. And I knew for me, it was time. I knew like there's other things I want to do in life. I was restless and it was time to move on. But man, that was a big step. Like I was giving up that twice a month paycheck. And, you know, in the private world, if you don't kill, you don't eat. And, you know, thankfully in the last couple of years, it's been good. I've been eating a lot, but then it ended in COVID. And so the risk, but for me, coming to that mental point where, you know, okay, you're going to do this. It was a big thing. A lot of people looked at me like, are you crazy? Just go work at Boeing, just take a normal job or whatever.
Right, right.
And that's just not me. That's not who I am. So I had to be true to myself. And what it came down to, I wanted to do speaking as a way to earn an income. And I went and interviewed at Under Armour. I was really trying to figure out what I was going to do when I grew up. And, because I knew Kevin Plank, I know the CEO, awesome guy. And I got this speaking gig in Australia. It paid pretty well for a week in Australia. And I was like, you know what? If I can get one, I can get 100. This will happen. So I kind of I changed my career, left the government with one, you know, paid event on my calendar. It was, and I just came to the point where I know this is it. I know, you know, I have to go. Now, I didn't jump into something completely crazy with no chance of happening. I knew there was at least some hope that, yeah, other astronauts have done this. I think I can do this, but it was still definitely a leap of faith for sure.
Yeah. There is a couple other questions, a little out of order, but I want to make sure people get it.
Yeah, let's jump in.
What are the potential environmental risks or imbalances to Earth and the solar system of mining moon and asteroids? Are you just scraping these surfaces, or is there actually a more meta risk there?
There's no risk to the solar system. The solar system is not going to even notice that humans are here. Now, the individual planets might, right? Like Earth has noticed for sure. And it's not going to last forever. It's going to fix itself, but it may be hundreds of years or thousands of years. In the billion-year time frame that you're looking at, we're just a blip there. But for the solar system, if you go scrape an asteroid or whatever, that's not going to be an issue. One minor thing, NASA was talking about having a mission, the asteroid redirect mission, where you put some thrusters and you actually move an asteroid out of its orbit. So that's a really minor change. You might want to move an asteroid to a place where it doesn't hit Earth and destroy all life, or it's easier to mine or something like that. But those are pretty minor things. You know, when you look at like carbon and climate change, there's nothing that we can do. If we launched all of our nuclear weapons, they would just disappear, and we're not going to affect the solar system writ large.
Yeah. Terry, thank you. I promised people we'd keep it to an hour, and that's where we are now. So I can't tell you how much I appreciate this. And
this has been great.
Hopefully we can have dinner someday.
Yeah.
Or Tang or something.
Yeah, I'll bring some like some little NASA green bags and some rehydratable crunchy food, and it'll be good. That'll be fun.
Were you worried about running out of food in your 7 month?
You know, I wasn't worried about running out. And I knew during my time I'd be okay. But like future crews, it was getting kind of sparse. And when the SpaceX rocket blew up, there's a small team of managers that have to track this stuff. And those guys were sweating. I know they were working weekends for sure, trying to make sure. But you know what? They had done a great job. They're NASA, so they had planned on contingency and contingency. They did what NASA does great, and we didn't have to reduce the crew. Back when the Columbia blew up, the space shuttle Columbia, the space station was growing, 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 and then it just stopped. And for years, we just launched two, a Russian and an American on their Soyuz because we didn't have enough food and supplies. And you could put some up on a Progress, but not that much. And we didn't have space shuttles. We didn't have SpaceX's or all these other things that we do now. So the space station has gone through, famine for sure. It wasn't a problem for me, but it would have been a problem for future crews had that fourth rocket blew up. Thank God it didn't, and it worked.
Right. So I'm going to ask this one last question. It's a ridiculous question. I apologize for everybody in advance. I'm terribly claustrophobic, and I'm wondering, that's got to be the initial screening of any pilot or astronaut. But do people ever does it come later? Is it possible that you're stuck up there and suddenly people are suffering from that?
When you interview, they put you in this little ball. They called it was like a astronaut rescue sphere. And they would put you in this, they put me in it and they zipped me up and they didn't tell me when I was getting out. And you're crunched up in a little ball. So I just fell asleep and rolled over. And anyway, but they said, well, if you're in a space shuttle, they'd have to rescue you and bring you to another space shuttle in this ball. It was just to see if you're claustrophobic. The only time I ever felt it, and the Soyuz, which is the space shuttle, is a big airliner. The Soyuz is this little, it's like being in the front seat of your minivan with 3 people, and you're cramped and you're in a spacesuit. So you're cramped and just visors down. And right before you land, the couch that you're laying in strokes. So it moves up about 6 inches. It's on shock absorbers. So when you hit the ground going 20 miles an hour, it doesn't break your back. And when that stroke happens, the control panel is like over here, and then boom, all of a sudden it's right there. So my right arm is smashed against the wall. I can't move anything. Your knees are up in your chest because the capsule is not that, you can't stretch your legs out at all. Put your knees in your chest, smash this, be in a spacesuit and have the thing right there. And I actually consciously thought, okay, I can either panic and I'll be strapped, and you're strapped down so tight you can't move and I won't be able to move or do anything about it, or I can not panic and I'll be strapped down so tight that I can't do anything about it. So I actively made the conscious decision to not panic, but that was the closest I've ever come, because that's pretty claustrophobic. But a couple minutes later, you hit the ground in a big car crash, and then you're on Earth, and so life is good again.
Have you seen other pilots or astronauts hit that
Freak
claustrophobic
out.
sort of MRI wall?
MRI. I had to do an experiment with those things. I got a funny story about that. I don't know if we have time, but I had to go in there for like an hour and a half, and they would monitor me. I would have tasks to do, and they were watching what my brain did while I was doing tasks. And then when I got back, I was doing the same thing. And I remember it just sucked. And you hear that noise and you're strapped in, and that was not fun. And I remember, and then they told me after I landed, they said, oh, you don't have to come to the next one. And I didn't complain. I didn't ask. A year later, I'm at this conference. 2 weeks after I leave NASA, I'm at a conference in Norway. And this lady's like, oh, I'm a NASA scientist. So what'd you do? Blah, blah, blah. Well, it turns out she was doing my brain experiment. And I said, well, how did my brain do? I don't know. No one ever told me. So she's like, well, it was all randomized and I was number 25 or whatever I was, but we were able to figure out who I was based on time. So she went through and she was like, oh yeah, your brain shifted. And she showed me these pictures. My brain moved like 2 millimeters. And I was like, did it go back to normal? And she said, oh, I don't know. We ran out of funding, so they canceled the study. So she literally told me my brain shifted and she doesn't know if it went back to where it's supposed to be.
I'm just struggling a little bit with a guy who spent 7 months in a aircraft, stranded up there, struggling with an MRI. It's almost like Tiger at the Masters shot a 10 on a par 3. It's like, I don't even understand why that bothered you.
I don't know. I don't like ledges either. If I'm like on the top of a building or a mountain or something like that, I hate walking up to the ledge. If you strap me to a airplane, I'll go fly upside down all day long.
Yeah.
But standing on a ledge with nothing, I don't like that. But you know what I do? I always make myself do it. I was zip lining here, so I walk over to the edge and I watch, and I hate it. My heart's beating, and I just force myself to do it so that I can prove
Good
to
for you.
myself that I can make myself do things I don't want to do.
Yeah. Well, Terry, thank you. We didn't even get into flying cars. We ran out of time. Hopefully
That's all
folks
right.
see how fascinating this conversation can be. And I hope to have you on again.